bit late. All right, let's get started with a word of prayer and then we'll dive in. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study of your word. Thank you for those that are present here today. Be with those that are sick or traveling and pray that they might be able to be with us at the next appointed time. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Genesis chapter 34. That's where we're going to spend our time today. Genesis 34. Sorry, didn't speak up. We've been studying the women of the Old Testament, and we're actually going to bring that study to a close today. I'm sorry, I said Genesis 34. I meant Genesis 30. It's going to be our jumping off point. We are going to go to Genesis 34, but we're starting in Genesis 30. So, beginning here in Genesis 30, the author of Genesis is telling his readers the story of Jacob and his two wives, Rachel and Leah. Rachel, if we know her story, she was the more loved of the two. But at this point in Genesis, the author is recording for his readers what I'm calling a record of the children Rachel and Leah had given to Jacob between the two of them. But in verse 20 of this chapter, if you'll look with me there, the text says, "And Leah said, God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun." And then verse 21 tells us that afterwards she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. So she had sons, but there's also this daughter named Dinah. Now, we know very little about Dinah, but from the little bit that we do know is in Genesis 46:15. We're not going to go there. But in Genesis 46:15, something we know about Dinah is that of all the daughters of Jacob, Dinah is the only one who's specifically named. In other words, Jacob had other daughters, but of those daughters, Dinah is the only one who's specifically named. Now, it's this fact alone, the fact that she's the only daughter of Jacob who's specifically named, that gave her and gives her a place in the history of God's people. Now, something else we know about Dinah is that her name is the feminine form of the name Dan. We know Dan was one of the sons of Jacob. Dinah is the feminine form of that name. Now, the name Dan in the masculine form means to judge. Dinah means judgment. So this is who we're going to spend time with today, is this woman, Dinah. We're going to look at, in looking at her, we're going to look at one of the most famous stories about her, and that's where we're going to go to Genesis 34. But anything else on, any questions or comments on Dinah up to this point? Okay. Well, now let's go to Genesis 34, where we're going to spend the rest of our time today. Now here in Genesis 34, we read one of the only stories we have about Dinah. And this story shows us, among other things, that Dinah, she led what I'm calling a difficult life. She made a choice, and part of that choice, part of the consequences of that choice was that 2 of her brothers went to extremes in an effort to protect her from those consequences. So what we're going to do today is look deeper into the story we find here in Genesis 34 And we're going to look for ourselves, consider for ourselves 3 points about the difficulty of Dinah's life as it's described in this one chapter of Genesis. We're going to kind of just survey it, is what I'm calling it. But the 3 points we're going to look at, point number 1 will be from verses 1 and 2 of this chapter. We're going to consider the fact that Dinah was raped. We'll talk about that. The second point we'll look at from verses 25 through 27 is that Dinah was avenged by her brothers. And finally, the third point we'll look at from verse 31 of this chapter is that Dinah was treated as a harlot. So we're just going to look at pieces of this chapter, but the application we'll take from these things is that we too, as the people of God, will sometimes encounter difficulty, and that when we do encounter those difficulties, we must seek the wisdom of God in order to deal with those difficulties. So we'll start off in verses 1 and 2 of Genesis 34. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses.
Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. When Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her and lay with her by force.
All right, thank you, Hal. So, this point is introduced with the author of Genesis recording something Leah did. Now, in verse 1, what did she decide to do? Okay, she went to visit the women of the land. New American Standard has the daughters of the land. So that's that's the point being made here. But before we reach that point in the verse, we're reintroduced to Dinah, in a sense. It says, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob. That takes us back to Genesis 30, that we just looked at, verse 21. But the same language is used here. Now, one possible reason Dinah is identified in this way, at least at this point in Genesis 34, is because she is going to play a major role in this story that we find in the 31 verses that make up this chapter. But even though Dinah is kind of the central figure of this chapter, we don't find any words from Dinah herself. But that all the same, she is the focus of this story, and that's why verse 1 begins the way it does. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob. But then we reach this statement about her. She went out to visit the daughters or the women of the land. So, with that in mind, the author is telling us that on one occasion, Dinah went out to see the women of the land. And these are the women who were residing in the land where Leah and Jacob were at when the events of chapter 34 happened. So, just to pick brains a little bit, just ask some more questions of this verse. Why would she go out and do this?
Because like so many of us, we're in this situation and we look at what the enjoyment that the other people are having, and we're tempted by what they do and think, well, I'll just go out and kind of see if I can do it too.
Okay, so there might be some temptation involved because they're in this new land, possibly the land of Canaan, and they see these other people. So that's what's been said about her, is that there's some curiosity going on here. She wants to go see what people are doing, what these women of the land are doing. But what context indicates, this would be what I'm calling a fatal mistake on her part, and we'll see that in verse 2. Any other questions or comments on verse 1?
Sounds like she was all by herself, too. Why not would she do something like that?
Yes, that's possible that she was by herself when she went out and did this, and verse 2 will lend some possibility to that. Anything else on verse 1? All right. So verse 2, Dinah has gone out to visit the daughters of the land. Then we're introduced to this other character, this other person in this story, and this is Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite. Hivite or Hivite, I'm not sure how that's pronounced. But what does he do? The language suggests she rapes her. Now, what are we told about Hamor? Who is he? The prince of the land. So he's in a position of royalty. And then, yes, the text says he took her. Language suggests maybe he kidnapped her. And the text says lay with her by force. So, with that in mind, the first thing we should understand here is that this Shechem, the son of Hamor, the prince of the land, this isn't the first time we run into him. The last mention of him we have in Genesis is just in passing, back in Genesis 33, verse 19. Text says, as it does here, he's one of the sons of Hamor, and his relationship with Jacob, according to that verse, is that he bought a piece of land in what Genesis 33:18 calls the city of Shechem in the land of Canaan. So it's from Genesis 33 that we know they're in the land of Canaan at this point. This is somebody that Jacob has bought a piece of land from. But we get here to Genesis 34. He sees Dinah, takes her, and lays with her by force. And that's just a way of saying that he kidnapped her and forcibly had relations with her. In short, he raped her, is what the language suggests. But even though that's the case, the phrase lay with her by force could also be translated as he humbled her. Now, the idea of humbling her does not necessarily suggest rape, but simply refers to the act of sexual relations, but the possibility of rape is involved here.
By force does.
And by force, definitely does.
Does definitely say rape.
Yeah. So, but whatever the case, the context of the chapter indicates that what Shechem did was construed as a crime, and then Dinah's brothers are going to seek vengeance for this. Questions or comments on verse 2? Okay. So putting verses 1 and 2 together, the point about Dinah we should see here is that she was raped. That's what the language suggests. Shechem engaged in inappropriate relations with Dinah. But even though that's the case, the question still remains whether or not this was actually rape or if there was some other criminal act that was committed because Shechem engaged in this behavior with Dinah, and that's what we're going to discuss a little bit. Now, one possible reason another criminal act is involved is because of something we read in verse 14 of this chapter. We'll just touch on that really quick. But verse 14 of this chapter says, they said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. So verse 14 has the idea, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a few moments, that one criminal act that might be involved is the fact that relations were had with someone who is not part of God's chosen people. So that's also part of the picture here. But another possible criminal act involved here was that Shechem engaged in sexual relations with Dinah without being married to her. And that's why Shechem, later in the chapter, will ask for Dinah's hand in marriage. So these are just some things that lay some groundwork that move us into our next point in verses 25 through 27. Dinah was avenged by her brothers. So let's jump down to verses 25 through 27, if somebody wouldn't mind reading those verses.
Now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, that the two sons of Jacob, Simon and Levi, and his brothers, each took his sword, and came boldly upon the city, and killed all the males. And they killed Hamor, the Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house, and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain, and plundered the city, because their sister had been defiled.
All right, thank you, dude. So, the point we're going to look at is that Dinah was avenged by her brothers. Now, this point is introduced. The author, as we've seen in the text, in verse 25, it says, on the third day, the brothers are in pain. These two brothers being identified as Simeon and Levi. And what do? They came and repaid. How did they do that? Killing everybody, every male in the city. So, this is what the verse tells us. Now, we got to give this verse a little bit of context. One of the first things we should understand is that what brings us to this point in the story is the fact that after Shechem had done what he had done, he essentially falls in love with Dinah. He asks for his father to get her for him, Shechem's father. And Jacob has heard what has happened to Dinah. Now, the result of this is that Shechem's father engages in conversation with Jacob, and he asks Jacob to give Dinah to his son in marriage. In response to these things, Jacob's sons say that this is not something that should happen because Shechem is among those who are uncircumcised. That's verse 14. And that leads them to make the condition that if Shechem was going to marry Dinah, all the males in Canaan had to be circumcised. That's the deal they make. So Shechem and his father, they agree to this condition, and all the males of the city do as well. So all the males are circumcised at this point. But then we have this language on the third day. 3 days after that agreement is made, how are Simeon and Levi feeling? They're hurt. They're in pain, the text says. And so this leads them to do what they do. They take their sword. They come on the city. Every male in that city is destroyed. They're killed. Questions or comments on verse 25? All right. True. Yeah, this would not be appropriate. So.
No, they don't have the Mosaic law, but God commanded circumcision long before the Mosaic law.
That's true. Circumcision is already in place here because of his dealings with Abraham. Anything? Oh, go ahead. For God's people, yeah. Right.
That also, lying and deceitfulness not have been approved.
Yeah, that would definitely not be approved. So.
There was so much deceit in the Old Testament.
That's true.
From just everybody gave kind of their idea of something, and it wasn't exactly what happened.
Right.
They promised something, that changed.
Right, and there was even deceit in Jacob's family with the whole Jacob and Esau situation that we've discussed before. Anything else on verse 25? Okay. So, Simeon and Levi have killed every male, but that point is emphasized with verse 26. Who do they kill among the males in verse 26? Hamor and who else? And Shechem. The two of the other central figures of this story. They even kill them. And what else do they do according to verse 26? What do they do with Dinah? Yeah, they take Dinah. Essentially, they take her home. They get her back. And finally, the text ends with they went forth. Now, from the idea of Simeon and Levi having went forth, from the context refers to the fact that after doing what they did here in verse 26, Simeon and Levi carried out further destruction. That's seen in the fact that in verse 27, the text says, Jacob's sons came upon the slain and looted the city because they had defiled their sisters. So they've killed every male, but what else do? They plunder the city, and what does that mean? They looted it. They took, what was that, Dean? They took whatever they wanted. So they take the spoils, we might say. So this is a further description of the destruction Simeon and Levi carried out against the city. They took their possessions. Why? Okay, that's true. But according to this verse, why did they do it? Their sister had been defiled. Now this is more where we can assume there was some rape involved because of this defiled language. So it was Shechem who did this. But Simeon and Levi, they're punishing the whole city. Go ahead. Okay. All right.
And it does say Jacob's sons, so in verse 27.
That's true.
You wonder if it wasn't just Levi and Simeon, but more of them. I don't know.
That's possible, but from the context, we can assume it was Simeon and Levi because verse 25 tells us they're the ones that did that. But we can't know if any of the other sons were involved. But up to this point, it's been Jacob or Simeon and Levi that have been discussed. So it was Shechem who did this to Dinah. But Simeon and Levi, they're in such pain that they're punishing the whole city, the males of the city. And all because of what happened to Dinah. So putting verses 25 through 27 together, if we're...
The pain they're talking about is all the males were circumcised.
Okay, that's also true. They came out on the third day. It says when they were... That's also true. It might be coming from that as well. But it all stems from what happened to Dinah. And we see that at the end of verse 27. So they would, from the context, we can suggest that the pain of the agreement that was made as well. So that's a good point. But applying all this to Dinah, the point about Dinah is that she was avenged by her brothers. That's what Simeon and Levi are doing. They're taking vengeance on what had happened to Dinah. But from the context, as we'll see, is that this is something that they should not have done. They should not have taken out this vengeance. All the males had agreed to be circumcised if Shechem was going to be allowed to marry Dinah. And so what the author also shows in these verses then is that this action on the part of Simeon and Levi, it was emotionally driven. They did these things out of that sense of pain. They made that decision because of the emotions they were feeling. And this is 3 days after the agreement had been made for all the males of the city to be circumcised. Anything else on these verses before we move to our last point? Okay. Well, let's jump down to the end of the chapter. And the point we're going to look at there is that Dinah was treated as a harlot. Now, there's not much here as far as a whole that we can break down. But we find a question. What's the question being asked here in verse 31? Is that, how does yours read?
Should he be treated, or should he treat our sister like a harlot?
Okay, should he treat our sister like a harlot? Or should he treat her sister as a harlot? Is how the New American Standard reads. But so they're asking this question. But before we deal with the question, we have to give a little bit of context, as always. So, what brings us to this point? Simeon and Levi have taken vengeance. We saw that in verses 25 through 27, and took the possessions as well. But in verses 28 and 29, we find some more of that described. Verse 28 and 29 say, they took their flocks and their herds and their donkeys and that which was in the city and that which was in the field, and they captured and looted all their wealth and all their little ones and their wives, even all that was in the houses. So they take everything, including family members. But then verse 30, we find Jacob's response. It says, then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble on me by making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites, and my men being few in number, they will gather together against me and attack me, and I will be destroyed, I and my household. So how's Jacob feeling about this according to verse 30? He's not happy at all. Why is he not happy? What does he think's going to happen?
He's going to be destroyed. That they'll get everybody. I don't know who they are, but the Canaanites, Perizzites, they will come together, knowing this. They'll come together and come after Israel.
Just like they had sought revenge.
Right.
Then Jacob's saying, now these people are going to seek revenge against me, just like what you did, and they're going to destroy all of us. It's just going to build.
Exactly. Now, Jacob, we might be able to assume, has built a pretty good relationship with these people. But now Simeon and Levi have done what they've done. Naturally, Jacob's saying, they're going to turn against me. And he's outnumbered from all this. So he's basically scolding his sons for doing what they did. He's telling them, you should not have done this. But then we have this question. Should he treat our sister as a harlot? So just based on that question, what are Simeon and Levi doing? How are they responding to what Jacob said? They're justifying their actions. In their minds, they had every right to do this. So this is a rhetorical question that they're asking. Jacob's sons are justifying what they've done because they feel that their sister's been treated as this harlot. Now, what's a harlot? What's a whore, a prostitute is the equivalent. So, with that in mind, this is how they're feeling, that their sister has been treated as a prostitute. Now, even though that's the case, there's nothing that in the chapter that directly suggests that Dinah was viewed as a prostitute, but Simeon and Levi feel that she was treated as such. Hal, go ahead.
Had they just gone in and killed Shechem, or took him, judged him, and killed him, or whatever, then the question about the other countries coming back probably wouldn't have come up.
That might be true.
Their sons went in and destroyed everything as a consequence from what the parents did, the fathers did.
Mm-hmm.
So it just multiplied.
Yeah. It just multiplied, and that's why Jacob's afraid that everybody's going to turn against him. So, because they went to very large extremes in what they did, Simeon and Levi. But here in this question, we see that they believe Dinah was treated as a prostitute. We've covered that. But we have to ask why they held this belief. One possible reason that they held this belief is because in verse 12 of this chapter, payment was offered for Dinah to marry Shechem. In their minds, that's prostitution. They might have construed that as payment being given to a prostitute. But what that also shows is how these brothers not only viewed Shechem and everybody, but also how they viewed their sister. it's possible that they themselves viewed their sister as a prostitute. So they had, if that's the case, they had a poorer view of their sister than they did the people living in the city. But something else we should notice here is that Jacob does not respond to this question. At least it's not recorded. Instead, what's recorded beginning in verse 1 of chapter 35 is what God said to Jacob concerning the need for he and his family to leave this city and move on to the city of Bethel. And that further indicates that the question here in verse 31 was rhetorical in nature. Jacob does not respond to the question. Instead, God begins communicating with him in verse 1 of chapter 35. So any questions or comments on verse 31?
Well, I don't know about the bridal payment. I mean, I think that's still common in a lot of cultures.
That's true.
The dowry, but it said that they retrieved Dinah from his household, so
Right.
she was being held, in his household before a marriage had taken place.
Right. So that's true.
And there's nothing in the scriptures that say how Dinah felt about all of this.
Right.
either.
Dinah is not mentioned. There's no words from her herself, but we do know she's the central figure in this story because of verse 1. So that being said, there's a lot we can learn about Dinah just from the events of this story. Anything else on verse 31? Okay. So the point we should see about Dinah from verse 31 is that, at least as far as her brothers believe, she was treated as a harlot. In their mind, she was treated like a common prostitute. But again, this belief may have come from the fact because of their misunderstanding of the payment that was offered to marry her. But the brothers' belief was misguided, and it was driven by nothing more than the pain they were feeling at what happened to their sister and everything involved with that. So, that's Genesis 34 in a nutshell. But the 3 points about Dinah that we can glean from this chapter is that her brothers believed she was treated like a common prostitute or working back. And, this is about the difficulty of her life. I'm going back to verse 31. She led a difficult life. If we're putting all this together, she led a difficult life is the main point we should see. And that was seen in the fact that she was raped, she was avenged by her brothers, and finally, as far as her brothers were concerned, she was treated like a harlot. But the application for us in all of this is that we too will face difficult times. We are not immune to difficulty. We know that. But what the story of Dinah also shows is that we have a family who loves us and will be there for us. Her brothers had a great love for her. I think that's without argument. But that did cause them to do something that was misguided, terribly misguided. But what that teaches us is that when we do face those difficulties, we should seek God's wisdom so that we don't do things from an emotional standpoint. In a worst case scenario, if we make those decisions that are emotionally driven, people could lose their lives. That's what happens in the story. Any other questions or comments? Jane?
It's always bothered me that it's the woman that takes all the brunt of it. What about the guy who just did the defiling?
That's true. Sometimes the woman catches the brunt of it. We see that in some cases. And
What do you mean some cases?
in some cases in the scriptures. In the scriptures. I'm talking about in the scriptures is what I'm talking about. But the guy is not justified. So we know that.
Tell me one.
I don't have any off the top of my head.
I don't think there
What about Ruth? And what's your point on Ruth?
She didn't suffer.
what?
She was the bad things are going on around there. And so she went to her husband, the king, and she straightened things out.
Okay, I gotcha. So are you talking about Ruth or Esther?
Pardon me, Esther.
It was Esther?
And Ruth,
Okay.
she went with,
With Boaz. Yeah.
no,
No, Ruth was Boaz. Esther was, her uncle was Mordecai. So, yeah.
but you read, I know what you're saying about the women have always been put as the
still
guilty when
are.
the men did the thing. You know, it was the woman's fault because of that. But when you go through the scriptures, you find so many women that were leaders that were above and beyond. And my sister had a lesson one time on the 5 women in Jesus' life.
Mhm.
And one of them was Mary Magdalene, which changed completely.
Yeah.
And I know we look at it that even nowadays, well, I don't remember when they passed the law that said women were women. And they were, or women were people, I mean, in the United States. But the women were, I'm standing up for the women, by the way. They were always, not always, most of the time, they were backing their husband or their friend or their male. And even now, the women's bloc is powerful.
Yeah.
And the 2 guys that think they're running for president, they're after the women's bloc.
Hmm. Okay. Um,
Well, I think in the cultures of that time, women were often just viewed as property.
that's true.
And, but we see how Jesus loved and treated many women. We have many examples of, just like you mentioned Mary Magdalene, culture would have ostracized her, and look how Jesus treated her.
Yeah. Jesus treated women
So
very well.
we know that God wants women to be treated well because Jesus gave us that example.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, appreciate all your guys' input. We're out of time, but Hal, would you close us in prayer today?